Well, it's our pleasure today to have a session about the central Scottish parish of URRAY. And I hope you're all going to really enjoy this, because it's quite a contrast to some of the others that we've looked at and described in a very different way. For the research has been done by Sandy McLennan from Heswell in the Wirral, and Sandy has a direct connection with URRAY in that his grandfather was born at Mains of Taradale, URRAY, in 1887. So I'd like you to welcome Sandy to make this presentation.
Okay. Can you hear me all right? Yeah?
Yes. Fine, thank you.
Okay, jolly good. Okay, well, thanks very much. Yes, as Bruce said, my family connection goes back to URRAY. Although I was born in Glasgow, my father's family are all from various parts around the Black Isle area, and also from, say, the parish of URRAY. Whoops. There we go. So, what are we going to do? Well, as we've been doing with all the previous talks, so we'll provide an account of the everyday life in the parish of URRAY in the 1790s. And that will be having a look at the general geography, topography, some details of the population, employment, housing, poverty, health, diet, etc., etc. We'll look at farming in the parish, and we're actually I'm going to share this talk with Bruce, and Bruce will be coming in now and again. He's going to say something about farming and the crops and the animals and the other produce. And then we'll have a look at how the population got around. We'll take a look at the heritors who owned the land and the ministers who cared for their flocks, and something about the churches in the parish. And then Bruce will come back in and tell us something about some of the notable McLennans from the parish. And then I'll finish off with some things about some other notable people and features of interest in URRAY. Okay, well, as before, the information is drawn mainly from the old statistical account, in this case written in 1793 by the Reverend John Downey of URRAY Parish Church, and we'll hear more about him later. URRAY is actually a composite of two older parishes that joined together quite a long time before 1790s, called URRAY and Kilchrist. And the name, according to Downey, probably comes from the Gaelic URRAY, a new ford, relating to a crossing across the River Orrin at the hamlet of URRAY, from which the parish gets its name, and we'll see where that is just in a minute. Just where the Orrin nears its confluence with the Conan, there was a ford there prior to any bridges being built, so that may well be the derivation. There are other derivations that have been given, but we'll stick to Downey's derivation. So where exactly is the parish of URRAY? Well, if you see in the left-hand map, it's down at the south end of Ross-shire. So you can see it's a long, thin parish going almost the whole width of the country at that point. But it does overlap a little bit into Inverness-shire, the odd place just on the southern border there. If we can zoom in a little bit on, this is the outline of the whole parish now, as it is. But you can see there are two quite distinct sort of topographical regions of this low-lying eastern end here, which is where currently and also in the 1790s most of the population actually lived. But the bulk of the parish, say, stretches way inland in this very sort of hilly and mountainous region. We could take a look at those two different parts of the parish separately. The eastern low-lying end stretches about 7 miles or 11 kilometers from top to bottom, from Bewley in the south, just to north of the River Conan. And again, we can see, I'm going to have, excuse me a minute, I'm going to have to move some of these images of people out of the way here, which are getting in my way. Okay, we'll go from the Bewley there up to, say, just north of the River Conan. So the Conan is one of the important rivers that runs through the top end of the parish, and its tributary, the Orrin, runs all the way right down the centre of the parish. And here's the Orrin Reservoir, which didn't exist in those days. That's part of a more modern hydroelectric scheme. And I'll just pick out a couple of the settlements. The main town nowadays is Muir of Ord, which is here, and the little settlement of URRAY, say near the confluence of the rivers from which the parish gets its name. Looking at the hilly western end, again, here's the Orrin Reservoir again. The river actually sort of runs right down through here. So the parish really is centred along the valley of the River Orrin, right up to the western end where it borders onto the parishes of Lochhalsh and Loch Carron and Conton. At one time, actually, the parish was geographically divided into two separate regions, this west end and the east end, and Conton actually bridged the gap between the two, but nowadays it's all one continuous piece of parish. Okay, there's a couple of pictures here just to, again, outline the topography. In the OSA description, the valleys of the rivers Connon, Orrin and Bewley are described as being well wooded with good fertile clay for cultivation on the lower hill slopes. So you can actually see that, even though the west end of the parish is very hilly, you can see that nice greenery around about the river itself, which was quite good grazing land for cattle, which were taken up there in the summer months, as we'll hear later on. The other end, the low-lying end, round about the Muir of Ord, was described as being a mixture of picturesque cornfields with clumps of natural woodland, but mostly fairly barren, stony and dry moorland of relatively poor quality. It's a lot better now. It's been well cultivated for a long time, but at that time, the soil wasn't brilliant, and I've tried to represent that with a rather sort of scrubby-looking piece of ground round about Muir of Ord. A couple more pictures just to show how attractive an area it is. It really is quite pretty, and there again is the Orrin Valley, and you can see this green ground on either side, which may not have been great for growing crops, but was probably all right for grazing a few beasts on in the summer. And there on the other side, very pretty, the Falls of Orrin, very picturesque. Most of the land surrounding the homes of the heritors that we'll come see later on were planted with fir trees and other forest trees, and indeed the Mackenzies of Seaforth, one of the main heritors, had quite an extensive nursery for tree planting, and they planted a lot of trees in the area. Okay, what about the population? Well, in 1791, when the sort of census, if you like, was taken, there were 1,860 persons in the parish, with a fairly even split between males and females, but a surprisingly large number, about 420 under the age of 10. Over the 3 or 4 year period there, so 91 to 93, the average birth rate, which just at the time that Downey was in charge, was 40. The average of marriage is 11, but there were no burial records, no records of death, so it's difficult to gauge the actual sort of turnover. There were 248 families, 148 of whom had actually settled in the last 40 years. So there was clearly quite a flux in the population. It's by no means a static population. And a decrease had actually taken place since 1755. So you can see in 1755, 2,456 down to 1,860 in 1791. And this was accounted for, according to Downey, by annual emigrations to the south for the harvest, but also considerable numbers being enlisted into the Highland regiments at the commencement of he says the two last wars, which I guess he means the Anglo-French War and the American Revolutionary War. But that drop in population is balanced to some extent by migration of people coming in, mainly from the Hebrides, the West Coast, and the mid-Highlands. And in these regions, the previous few years had seen some very severe winters that appear to have ruined their crops and their animals. So they moved across for a better life. So the population is certainly not static by any means. And this large increase from immigrants, that accounts for the fact that there were 420 children under the age of 10, even though there's a relatively low birth rate. These families were coming in with lots of children. So I think it's an interesting point for discussion there. I don't know whether, I know Bruce likes his discussion points, whether any comments there. I don't think that the loss of people at this stage, probably not due to the clearances, that would come later on, but really quite an amazing internal turnover of people from different parts of Scotland into the area.
I think that's a pattern too, going forward. It's a sort of the thing that happens there in URRAY. Being a central throughway from the east to the west, people tend to come there as a sort of stopping off point on the way to the Black Isle or those sorts of things. That's just my guessing really, but They certainly always seem to be changing over there. Don't seem to stay there. They might emigrate too from the country, or they might go south, or
yeah.
That's a story. This through route, of course, through continent and so on, is an ancient Viking route to get from one side of the country to the other. It's a long-standing arrangement to go through this passage here. So it's no surprise then that people would come from the west coast and the Hebrides into the east side this way.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Well, apart from the landlords, the heritors, the people divided themselves into two groups, and we've come across these terms before. There were the tenants, excuse me, of whom there were about 120, who paid the landlords a rent of between £5 and £20. But the remaining families were the cottagers or cotters or mailers or mealers, various different names. And these people were allowed to build huts on the barren ground in order that they could improve the surrounding ground. And they were actually charged nothing for this for a stipulated number of years. There was no rent as long as they took on this poor ground and made it better. And indeed, the landowner would often give them free tools and free seed for the first year just to get them going. But once they were established and the ground was being a little bit productive, then rent was levied at somewhere between 5 shillings and £2. Certainly less than the tenants were paying, but presumably these were not such great patches of ground that they had. So where did they actually live? Well, according to Downey in his OSA description, there were no towns or villages in URRAY, with the population just being scattered about in little clutches of houses and very small communities. And even the biggest settlement today, which is Muir of Ord, barely existed at that time. In fact, the original settlement at that point was called Taradale. And it was of no real significance as a town until, first of all, 1814, when there was a bridge constructed over the Conan up here, Conan Bridge, obviously. And that allowed the convergence of drove roads from the north and the west and other points at Taradale. Everything, as you can see, the roads are all converging at what is now Muir of Ord. And that allowed the establishment of a major cattle market at a site close to Taradale, which was called the Muir of Ord. And then later on, the Glen Ord distillery was founded, and then later on again in the 1860s, the railways arrived. So all that brought in people to settle around this area. And because the station was called Muir of Ord after the site of the cattle market, and as the population expanded out from there, it expanded to include the original settlement of Taradale, and Muir of Ord then became the name for the whole town in 1862. But that really still is the only place of any size. And if you look at, say, the Marybank, Urrey and Wind Hill, if you just take a quick peer down on Google Maps at the sizes of the other places, you can see that nowadays they're basically just a few houses round about crossroads. And so in the 1790s, they would have been even smaller. So there were, say, no great sizes of settlements. Now, interesting, even though, as I've said, the population in Taradale or Muir of Ord did expand, and its current population now about 3,000, it expanded, but the population in total of the parish of URRAY peaked around about 1830 and then really began to drop off. And that, I'm guessing, was probably due to Highland clearances on the rural population. But that's a topic, I think, for another time, not something to be covered in this series of talks on the 18th century. Okay, employment. What did the people actually do? Well, as usual, the main occupations were in agriculture, and that's something, say, Bruce will talk to in a few minutes. Farm labourers from the Mealers were hired at about 6pence a day, and they got paid additional money for harvest time. These are both men and women that carried out this work, not just the men. Common men servants were also hired from about £3 a year, and women at £1.10. So terrible, they're earning far less than the men, who'd have thought. And younger people, both boys and girls, and some of the married men would go south to earn the harvest wages in the summer and then come back at the winter. Now, in addition to agriculture, were a number of other professions, and these professions all are classified amongst the mailers or the mealers. So you can see there were 21 shoemakers, 20 weavers, 15 tailors, and a small number of millers, masons, and carpenters. So almost all these tradesmen seem to be involved in providing clothing and housing for the local people, and nothing was of any significance was actually made for export. Data taken from clan statistics shows that this distribution of professions amongst the mailers was pretty typical of McLennans throughout the whole of Ross-shire. This is data, say, from the clan site showing all the different trades, and all the ones in Urray figure pretty well in the same position in the whole of the area, apart from fishing, because Urray was not a fishing community. Okay. In addition to their day jobs, quite a number of people were involved in whiskey production. I don't have an actual figure for this, but it was a sort of second job for a lot of people. And again, that's something we'll return to in a minute. For that reason, there was one exciseman who lived in the parish, and no doubt his work was cut out. But there was no physician, no surgeon, or no man of the law actually living in the parish. So they would have to get somebody from outside for all those things. Okay, farming. Bruce, do you want to come in here now?
Thanks, Sandy. You know, we've seen this list before, barley, oats and potatoes as a typical sort of produce for places. But here I think there's quite a difference to it. And we'll see shortly how the barley production was very important to this particular parish for very good reasons. And one thing that Sandy has explained there, I think you would have picked up, is that the parish is quite a sort of dry pocket. It's a pocket with mountains surrounding it. So that to the west, you have the great mountains of the Western Highlands. To the north, you have the mountains, and the distance to the coast on the east side is the full length of the Bewley and Murray Forth, and also the Cromarty Firth. So, sorry, Firth, then the Cromarty Firth. So it's about 20 miles out to the east coast as well. And all this creates quite a dry atmosphere for growing crops, which rather like a bit of dryness for grain, I mean. So we'll come to why that's important in a minute, but just there's a big difference in this parish between the practices of the gentleman farmers, the you know, lairds, you might say, and the tenant farmers. And the gentleman farmers already have adopted enclosure and crop rotation as a normal practice. The crops are enclosures, that means fences, of course, you know, so some sort of fencing, probably no barbed wire yet at this point, but, you know, they would have probably stone fencing or something of that kind. The rocks that are in the ground there are quite large. They're described as being about the size of a new baby. That's how I think of it. 6 to 7 pounds, or what you might call about 3.5 kilos, normal new baby size. And so they'd be quite suitable, although they were fairly rounded, those rocks, for fence making. But anyway, they've managed to enclose their farms. And as we saw in Ken's session last time, that was something that became important as time went on, but it was resisted by the traditional farmers. Anyway, the crop rotation followed this pattern of fallow, grain, and then greens. And then that was a better way of maintaining the balance in the soil and getting better crops out of it. Of course, we know this now. And they probably used the English plough, and we'll see an example of those pictures of that shortly. The tenant farmers, on the other hand, tended to have unenclosed fields, and animals could wander about and stomp on the grass and stomp on the crops and nibble the shoots and nibble the produce and so on. And they tended to use the traditional plough. Someone can pronounce it. Hamish, you can probably do the best. You got your mic on. The plough. You know that name.
Not that one.
Huh? We'll get to it.
No.
Thanks, Hamish. How do you pronounce that, Hamish? Kilcarrock, something like that.
Kilcarrock.
So, yeah, the English plough patented, you know, around about this time, or patented a bit later, became the sort of used by the advanced farmers, and they can see that they're using a couple of Clydesdale-style horses here to pull it along, one person. But the more traditional method used by the tenants is to use bullocks to pull this Scots plough along, and you can see it's occupying several bullocks and several people to do it. So it's a bit less efficient in that way. Thanks, Sandy. Unless you want to add anything. And there's a small amount of flax. Sorry, and Sandy?
No, that's fine.
Small amount of flax produced, but not much mention of what that is. Flax for linen, of course, you know, quite widely grown in Ireland, flax this time. Thanks, Sandy. Now, this is the answer. This is going to be on the exam, this one, people. What did they do with all that barley that they made? Well, there were a lot of licensed stills, and probably even more unlicensed stills. My own ancestors came from right near here, and I've been to where the drying kiln still is there from the time, you know, going back such a long way, 200 years ago. And they produced not a whole lot of, compared to today's tens of thousands of litres of distilled whiskey. It wasn't very much really, but it was widely sold across the rest of Scotland, into the west coast and out to Skye and so on, with the whiskey made in this parish. And why? Because it had this dry climate that lent itself to further drying of the barley and then turning it into whiskey. So generally speaking, the people grew barley themselves, and if they didn't have enough of their own production, they would buy some from their neighbours, barley, or they'd even import it from outside the parish, from, you know, along towards Nan in that direction, or even out onto the Black Isle and so on. But the barley produced in the parish was regarded as a premium and worth more. They would pay more for it because of that. There's the price you can buy a gallon of whiskey for, Hamish. Sounds all right?
Yeah, sounds all right.
I wonder what it tasted like. A bit peaty, you reckon?
Oh, I often wondered what it tasted like. It didn't lie in bond for 3 years anyway.
That's for sure. Let alone 12 years. I don't think it lasted 12 years.
Oh, never.
So you got the still here with the, you know, heating up, the steaming across and then cooling down in the coil inside the vat there, and coming out the bottom. The taxing of these numerous stills was all a bit tricky, and of course they'd managed to produce a bit of grain illicitly at the grain mills, and they'd managed to produce a bit of whiskey illicitly at even the licensed mills, and of course then in the back blocks like my relations, they'd managed to produce some whiskey up in the hills, well known for it. So in a way, this sort of leads into the creation of the single mill there in Muir of Ord, or Taradale, as it was, you know, in the early 1838. So thanks, Sandy. So now let's look at the number of animals and so on that they had there in the parish. 120 tenants. It seems like a lot, doesn't it? 120 tenants. But typically each of them would have about, you know, like 4 horses, and that ties in with the sort of behaviour that they needed them for. There was a big problem collecting peat, so they had to go up into the hills to get peat, because there was no peat, no boggy, marshy areas in the valley. The valley, in fact, was so flat that the river would change course quite often, and wouldn't allow any build-up of sort of moisture and so on, too rocky. So that's a typical number of animals, and that's how he estimates how many horses there are, the minister. A mailer or a cotter would have about 1 or 2 horses and maybe 1 ox that they could use for various purposes. And so, as I mentioned, the peat was collected using the horses as well as ploughing and general transport. Carts were known, so, you know, that would have been something. Although you don't imagine the roads were terribly good. Cattle used for meat and dairy as well as for ploughing. In summer, the horses and the cattle, and perhaps even some of the sheep, would go up into the inland, perhaps the inland of the river, or maybe even other parts. You know, they'd go somewhere in westerly, but they'd go away. You know, this is what we've seen often in the shieldings in the summertime. Mothers and their children often would decamp for a number of weeks, 6, 8 weeks, some of that more, and have their grazing up there when the grasses and so on were young and not able to withstand hooves on them, and allowed the animals to fatten up on the pasture in the hills. Sheep were just reared for wool basically, and not really much, you know, raised for meat or exporting wool, just for their own needs. And there wasn't really even enough for that in this particular district. And the minister comments that on Sundays, he says, on a great deal of English cloth is seen at church every Sunday. I guess by that he means what then was known as calico, what we would call cotton today, was starting to come in. Although he calls it English cloth, in these days, the 1790s, cotton was being imported quite significantly from India, from Calcutta. That's why it's called calico. And the mills were starting up in you know, Manchester and so on, but also in Glasgow, in the Leven, the valley of the Leven, you know, out from Loch Lomond there, and in Glasgow itself. So these are the times when that's starting up. Cotton and became very popular. It was taxed. You know, people resisted cotton being. It was taxed early on to try and prevent it getting a start in taking over from wool, but it wasn't successful, obviously, and they lobbied enough and got it removed. Thanks, Sandy.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Back to me. So where did the population live? Well, again, it's a fairly typical looking house that a tenant or a cotter may have been in. Some would have been grander than this, some probably less so. Clearly a very important feature of living in something like that is how do you heat a little house like that? And for fuel, most of the population would have used peat. That was a standard, but estate proprietors, the landowners, also burnt coal as well as peat. As Bruce has alluded to, most of the farms did have peat mosses, but these were usually quite some distance away, and you know, collecting it was probably one of the most exhausting things that the farmers and their horses did. And Reverend Downey says, if it weren't for the tax on coal, the poorer tenants would be better off burning coal rather than wear out the horses. So clearly, going way inland to the hinterland and cutting and collecting the peat was quite an exhausting task, not just for the farmers, but also for the poor old horses. There were 62 people on the poor roll, if you take a look at poverty, but there were no specific funds available for support other than the weekly and special quarterly collections in the church. That totaled about £10 sterling, but I'm not clear if that is per quarter or per annum. That wasn't clear from what Downey said, probably per quarter, I think. Diet, what did the people eat? Excuse me. Well, diet is based predominantly on the homegrown oats and potatoes, but also some imported oats and potatoes. With a little barley, as I've seen, most of the barley went to make whiskey, but some of it was used for food. Fish was surprisingly popular. The rivers like the Conin would yield quite abundant salmon, pike, and sea trout. And something that surprised me when I looked at this is that there was actually salmon farming at the time. A company from Berwick down in the south of Scotland farmed salmon in the Bewley estuary. And most of that was actually sent to London, which is interesting. But some of it did find its way to the local families at a very reasonable twopence a pound. So they ate well, salmon, pike, maybe not so nice, and sea trout would be good. But in addition, they ate quite a lot of herring. The local herring were known as Keswick herring, and these would have been landed just up the coast in the Bewley Firth, probably fishing ports like Och. There's a picture here of the herring fleet at Wick, but I'm sure that Och would have looked fairly similar at that time, lots of little herring boats. The Keswick herring are leaner and smaller than those typically caught on the west coast, and so that for that reason they were considered unsuitable for export any distance, but they were very popular locally, and indeed even people came from as far afield as Aberdeen and Perthshire to buy the Keswick herring. Health. Well, Downey describes the population as being generally lively and healthy, because they worked outside, which is obviously good for them. There were lots of men in the 70s, few in their 80s, but none in their 90s. He says nothing of the women, typical of that time, obviously. We only ever hear about the men. Rheumatism was quite frequent amongst the population, again, because of the hard work, the labor that they did. But diseases of the more affluent, such as gout and gravel, which I believe are kidney stones, were pretty much unknown amongst the general population. Maybe the heritors had a little bit of that, but not the general population. However, in 1789, apparently a putrid fever spread from URRAY to the neighbouring parishes and then to the west coast and the Hebrides, causing dreadful havoc. Quite what he meant by putrid fever, he doesn't say, but my best guess would that would have been typhus, which is a group of bacterial infections that are transmitted by lice and fleas and chiggers and other loping beasties like that. So that, of course, there would have been no antibiotics in those days, so that wouldn't have gone down well. Interestingly, though, one thing that they could combat to some extent was smallpox, and Downey makes a comment here about smallpox. I just want to just go off piste here a little and say something, because I noticed in the latest Clan newsletter there was a little bit about inoculation of smallpox at this time, where Edward Jenner, who is normally considered to have introduced it, was given a bit of a hard time in that little article, a little bit unfairly, I think. This is something that is of interest to me. Jenner introduced the procedure of vaccination against smallpox about 1796, and vaccination, quite specifically, was the inoculation of material from cowpox pustules under the skin, and that gave a cross protection to smallpox. And the name vaccination comes from the Latin vacca, for a cow. But inoculation against smallpox had actually been around for hundreds of years before that. It probably came from China, possibly India, or even Africa. But it didn't really take hold in Europe, or certainly in the UK, till about the 1720s. And what that procedure was called variolation, from the name variola, which is the Latin for smallpox. And that involved the injection of actual material from smallpox pustules rather than cowpox under the skin. And that procedure had been available then for some time before 1790. It was a little bit dangerous, however, because it did give you smallpox, whereas the cowpox vaccination was very, very much safer. Although, funnily, again, mentioned in that newsletter, there was a guy called Johnny Williamson, or Johnny Notions, from Shetland, had discovered a much safer way of doing the variolation, because what he did was to bury the smallpox pus under the ground for several years. And clearly what that did was inactivate the viral, well, it would have been the DNA, which is needed for infectivity, would have been inactivated. But the virus proteins, and we're all familiar now with spike proteins from coronavirus, they would have still been intact. And so the immune system would have responded to that. So that was a much safer way of doing variolation, and may well have caught on had Jenner not introduced this cowpox vaccination. But As Downey says, the gentry inoculate the children for the smallpox with great success, but the great body of the people have not surmounted their religious prejudices against that innovation. So the anti-vax movement was clearly alive and well even at that time, but for religious reasons rather than anything else. Okay, little diversion there. Population, education, and language. Well, there was a single parochial school provided by the church through tax on the landowners, and that was, according to Downey, well attended. There was also a charity school and a spinning mistress provided by the SSPCK, which I think is an organisation we've, heard of before in these talks. If you're not familiar with it, the SSPCK was formed in, 1709 by a royal charter. And this is interesting. Its purpose was founding schools, I quote, where religion and virtue might be taught to the young and old in the Scottish Highlands and other uncivilized areas of the country. A bit of a cheek. Its purpose, I think, was to really counteract Catholicism and the growing popularity of the Jacobites. And it still exists today, although I hope its aims and objectives are a little bit different. Some of the common people could speak English, but Gaelic was the everyday language in Urray, except amongst the gentry. And the common people still preferred their religious, religious services in Gaelic. The SSPCK had actually introduced a combined Gaelic and English New Testament in 1767, which had Gaelic on one page and English on the opposite page, and that may seem a little bit at odds with the growing Anglicization, of religion and education that was prevalent at the time. But I guess the idea of having a dual language Bible was to perhaps wean the population off Gaelic and onto English, because they could see both side by side. And indeed, in 1790s, the SSPCK were quite happily using corporal punishment in schools against any child speaking the Gaelic. Again, that's an interesting point there. Discussion. I don't know whether we may well have some Gaelic speakers in the audience. What was wondering what people felt about the demise of Gaelic by force. Is that something that still rankles with the Gaelic speakers? Anyone got any remarks?
Well, my gran, the house I'm in right now, my gran comes from Lewis, and when she moved down with her family, she moved to this house, and she spoke Gaelic. That was her native tongue, and until the day she died, she still listened to the Gaelic news and BBC Scotland. So she was forced to speak English at school. She couldn't speak a word of English when she came down from the Hebrides.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But my dad can still speak it. Well, I don't know how much he understands now, but my dad can still. Sadly, I don't speak it, but I can understand a few words here and there, but not too much.
Gaelic in my language died out with my grandfather, but yeah, it's. I mean, that kind of thing is common all over the world. Sorry,
it's nice to see that they're trying to get it back up and running, and with the Gaelic schools in Glasgow.
Yeah. Okay. Moving on, morals and character. There we go. Well, Downey says a sense of religion and decency prevails among the people in general, which is nice. And there was only one capital offence recorded in the previous 50 years, so they were a fairly law-abiding group of people. However, as elsewhere, one thing that did concern the Reverend Downey was the establishment of dram shops or tippling huts in pretty well every village, although he said that villages didn't exist, but no doubt they were set up wherever they could possibly do it. And these are places where the young and idle convene and get drunk. Well, there's no change there, really, is there? He lamented the fact that no effectual mode has as yet been projected for suppressing them. So he clearly was against them, although it appears that these drunks cause less trouble than might have been expected. However, he does take quite an enlightened view in that in the end he says that the benefits of keeping people employed in distilling whiskey and so able to get an income and pay their bills probably outweighs the harmful effects on the population, because during the winter months there was no other industry to keep people occupied other than making and selling whiskey. So it's quite an enlightened view that you just, oh well, fair enough, they get drunk, but at least they're still alive. So, Okay, roads and transport. Well, we've mentioned that Muir of Ord is a sort of the convergence of various different roads, and Downey mentions the Great North Road, which is now the 862, and the County Road, the 832. So the 862, that's the Great North Road, runs up and down there, and the County Road would have been this one here, and also roads east of Fortrose and Cromarty, so up to Cromarty that way and Fortrose that way, and these all converged at Taradale. So there was quite a good road system, and it was kept in repair as far as the parish boundaries, thanks to the heritors and the landlords. They provided the money to do that. People would have got about, though, mainly on these roads in horse and cart. And there's a horse and there's a cart, but this cart doesn't have wheels. I just threw in this little picture. I think Bruce mentioned earlier on, and I've mentioned, the difficulties in peat cutting, the fact that the tracks and the roads wouldn't be very good. It was probably easy just to drag crates on runners, really, from the peat mosses down to where the actual tracks were, and then transfer the material into something with wheels. So you can see how it would have been really hard work for the horses and for the people involved. But once they were on proper roads, if you can call them that, they would have been able to use wheeled vehicles. Excuse me. Okay, the heritors, the landowners. Downey mentions there being a total of 11 in the parish, but only 4 of these were actually permanently living in the parish. Downey doesn't actually say who they were, but my guess is that it was these families here, and we're going to actually have a look at these individually. First and foremost, the Mackenzies of Seaforth. Well, the Mackenzies were a dominant family right across the whole of the area, not just in Urry. Brain or Bran Castle, depending how you want to pronounce it, was the seat of the Mackenzies, and we can see where it's situated. Just blow that in there, just north of the Contin River there. Bran House, as it later became, was this has been the seat of the Clan Mackenzie for a long time. It was demolished, unfortunately, in the 1950s, so you can't actually go and see it. It'd been demolished several times before that. It was the site of a siege in 1715 after the first Jacobite rebellion, because the Mackenzies were staunch Jacobites, and after I think they defeated some of the Hanoverian supporting clans, the Rosses and the Munros at Alness, they then ganged up later on and laid siege to the castle and laid waste to the whole of the Bryan estate. But that was a bit before, and for that reason, and then the second Jacobite rebellion, the Earls of Seaforth, as they were known, sort of fell into abeyance. But the fortune of the family were revived by this Lieutenant General Francis Mackenzie, who titled himself, or was titled first Baron Seaforth rather than the Earl of Seaforth, and he was in head of the Mackenzies at the time that we're looking at in the 1790s. He was a man of many parts. He was a commander of the 78th Highlanders, and at various times he was MP for Rossshire, Lord Lieutenant of the county, Governor of Barbados, and also because he was a very keen botanist. I mentioned before he had this nursery of trees on the estate where they used for planting out that estate and others as well. And for his services to botany, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. So the Mackenzies were the main landowner. The Mackenzies were everywhere around here, it seems, as we know. Another heritors family were the Gallanders of Highfield. The Gallanders were originally factors on the Seaforth estate, but in 1779, this George Gallanders purchased the Highfield estate in Urry from Thomas Mackenzie of Applecross, and I think we heard about him in the Loch Carron presentation. So another Mackenzie, and this is where the Highfield estate is. So there's again, they're all quite close to Muir of Ord, these big houses. Highfield was up here. Again, it is no longer. Unfortunately, it was demolished, I think, but it actually burnt down in 1947. Nothing remains of it other than the lodges at the road entry point. I think there's one here and one here. The entries into the estate. The lodges are still there, but the old house is gone. This house here would not have been the one that was there at the time of George Galander's. This is a later one. The houses did tend to come and go. Another Mackenzie family, Thomas Mackenzie, so-called 5th of Ord, who was descended from John Mackenzie, the 1st of Ord. His seat, again, near Muir of Ord. There it is. It's now a hotel, the Ord House Hotel. So that actually is a building that's still in existence. His daughter Elizabeth married Alexander, who was the son of George Galander. So you can see these Heriter families were all, interrelated to one another, and indeed estates passed between one family and the other and back again. And most of them would also have held estates outside this particular parish as well. And one such was James Fowler of Fairburn. Now, Fairburn was originally owned by Mackenzies, no surprise. And the castle known as Fairburn Tower was actually, this is all that's left of it now, was built in 1545 for one Murdo Mackenzie, who was one of King James V's gentlemen of the bedchamber. And you can read into that what you like, but obviously it's a personal assistant to the king. But due to decline in family fortunes after the Jacobite rebellion, so the Mackenzies were on the Jacobite side, the tower eventually fell into disrepair, and the estate was then bought by one James Fowler in the 1780s. The Fowler family, there were 3 of them, 3 brothers, and they owned the Raddery estate near Fortrose, which we may hear about later, I don't know, in another talk. But they also had a number of estates in Jamaica, so they made their money, sadly, out of sugar plantations and slavery. And Fairburn House was here. It still exists, although again, this house is not the one that would have been there at the time. This is a Victorian replacement, but it's still actually there as a care home. The estate eventually passed back to the Mackenzies as a result of marriage. So again, another example of all these families being in each other's pockets, really. Okay, something a little bit different. I don't think we've seen before. I just pulled out for a couple of reasons. Taxation. Now, in the late 18th century, Scots were subjected to all sorts of different taxes. We don't need to mention them, but you can just see that whole list down there. Although in practice, these are mainly levied against the landowners and the wealthier householders. The simple people, the poor people, weren't necessarily going to have to pay many of these. A lot of these were brought in after 1793 to help pay for the war against France. That's the usual reason for bringing in taxes, is to pay for wars. And one of them I've just pulled out here was the farm horse tax. So we can see down in this sheet here, the farm horse tax levied in URRAY. So if you had a farm horse, you had to pay tax on it, simply. And you can see some of the names I've seen already, familiar names. Seaforth, as he would have been simply known by the title of the baronetcy, just Seaforth. And there's George Galander's Thomas Mackenzie of Ord, they all had horses. But interestingly, Mr. Downey, the minister that we've heard about, he had 4 horses. So clearly being a minister was quite a cushy number. If you could afford to have 4 farm horses, he had presumably other horses which he had to pay tax on as well, not just farm horses. But also one John McLennan from near Taradale, a fairly well-off McLennan there with 5 farm horses. Now, I've had a look, and I think Bruce has had a look in the clan database to see if we could identify which John McLennan this was, but we've not really, well, I've had no success yet identifying precisely who he is. Several possibilities, but that's maybe a little project for the future, see if we can identify this rather well-off McLennan. Don't think he's one of mine, unfortunately.
Yeah, although you've got a lot of Johns there, Sandy. It could be one of yours.
Well, there's a lot of John, yeah, but I think I've tracked down all the John McLennans on my side from Taradale, and not him, I'm afraid.
One of the things I did to try and find this particular John McLennan of Taradale was to use the notes search in our clan resources to look for the word Taradale, because it's quite a unique word. And there were pages and pages and pages of Taradale references in our clan database. Like there is, in fact, the problem isn't that there are so few people, but there are so many McLennans in this parish over the, and of course it doesn't differentiate particular periods. It's just finding every reference to every note that has a reference to Taradale. It went on for, you know, it was such a long exercise to go through all those individuals in our database who have the word Taradale in their notes about them. So it didn't really solve the problem, but of finding this particular one, but it really reminded me how many McLennans were in this parish.
Certainly John McLennan and Alexander McLennan, or Sandy, were common. I mean, in my family, the eldest and the second son were always called Alex and John, and so on. It's the same. My brother's John and I'm Alex or Sandy. So, and it goes back hundreds of years as far as I can see. So there's a lot of them, as you say. Anyway, the church. Well, the parish church in URRAY, it's obviously the established Church of Scotland, was built in 1781 at a cost of £900 sterling. And then it was described, well, in Downey's estimation, as the most elegant and substantial building of its kind in the country. And it's still standing today. It's now URRAY West Parish Church. It replaced an earlier building which was located on the old URRAY burial ground, just about a mile or so up the road, just a bit up here. And that original church and the later one were dedicated to St. Constantine or St. Madidus. I've seen both names referred to. I don't know whether it's dedicated to both or, well, it's a little bit of confusion there. I couldn't quite work out. The minister obviously lived in the parish, and here's the current, well, I think it's still there, current manse, Old URRAY manse. This is not the one that Downey would have been in, because this one was only built in 1814 after Downey had died, actually. He received a stipend of, I hope I've got the sums right here, of 10 chalders of barley. There's some ancient measurement, which according to my calculations, I may well have got it wrong because this seems like a heck of a lot, 6.8 tons or 7,000 kilograms of barley. Although spread over the year, I don't suppose that, maybe that's not that much. It would be interesting to know what he did with that barley, whether he distilled it into whiskey as well. It wouldn't surprise me at all. In addition to that, there was the glebe, which is a little bit of cultivable land associated with the manse, which would have yielded an annual income of about £140, which was again quite a significant sum in those days. So, as I've said before, the ministers were pretty well off. So who were the ministers? Well, prior to Downey, the man in charge in URRAY was the Reverend Patrick Grant. His only claim to fame that I came across is that he served in 1778 as moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. Now, I guess most of us here will know what that is, but in case anyone doesn't, it's the kind of the annually elected head of the Church of Scotland. Very democratic. There's no pope or archbishop. It's something that changes annually. And indeed, it's a position a cousin of mine held just a few years ago. So very prestigious, very prestigious.
Like a chairman, isn't it? Like a chairman's role.
Yeah, but he's regarded as the head of the church for that year, more or less. Then 1778, Reverend John Downey appears on the scene, an Aberdeen graduate like myself. He did previous appointments at Gaylord and Stornoway and was chaplain to Mackenzie's 78th Seaforth Highlanders at one point. And he died at the ripe old age of 84 in 1811. So that manse we saw was built for the next guy, MacDonald, obviously after his death. Presumably MacDonald didn't like the old manse and demanded a new one be built for him, something like that. Downey was well connected. He married Charlotte, the daughter of an Alexander Mackenzie of Tolly, who was the provost of Dingwall, and his mother was Annabella, the daughter of a Sir Donald Bain of Tulloch, so marrying well. They had 17 children, for goodness sake, poor Charlotte. One son, Alexander, and most of these survived actually, as far as I can tell. One son, Alexander, served as a minister of Lochalsh. Now, whether we hear about him again or not, I don't know. He was very good at writing letters, Mary's people, and in some of his letters, Downey expresses a concern by the level of emigration from the parish. And he also quite understand what he means by this, but expresses a worry at the failure of the sea force to prevent this emigration by military force. Having established already that a large part of the emigration was due to the people being, well, I was going to say signing up or being signed up to the armies to fight the wars, it's odd that Downey would perhaps want to see that stopped by military force. And indeed, some of his other letters, he says that the local population were very worried about being press ganged. So clearly they were always having to look over their shoulders.
Sandy, before you go off that slide,
Yep.
it's interesting, Tina will be interested in this, that, you know, the Alexander that you've got mentioned here, just talked about, is the minister who writes the old statistical account for Lockhouse that we're going to be doing at our next meeting.
Oh, well, there you go.
So
Nice
there's
little
a segue for you. So there's
nice
an excuse to plug next meeting, yeah?
I wish I'd have done it better if you'd told me beforehand.
Well, the person who's doing the research was in the meeting this morning, earlier today.
All right. Oh, jolly good, jolly good. Okay. Now there was a Church of Scotland was seen, but there was also quite an active Scottish Episcopal Church. Episcopalians have a strong tradition in the Black Isle area, and particularly around Muir of Ord. And there was one Episcopalian minister, ignore that, lived in the parish, and about 25% of the population there actually attended this Episcopal service that was held in this little house here, Ord Cottage, until 1836. That's still standing today. But thereafter, it moved to St Mary's Episcopal Church in the Highfield Estate. Now, I don't think that's there anymore. I'm not very sure. I have no record of it. He records that there were no nonconformists in the parish, but there presumably were Catholics as well, though, and though I found very little mention of them anywhere. He does say that when this Episcopalian minister also gave services at several other locations outside URRAY, and when he was absent doing that, then his flock, this 25%, were quite happy to attend Downey's church instead. So they didn't seem to be too concerned about the differences between the two types of service. Okay, Bruce, you were going to say something about the McLennans.
Yeah, would you like to talk about your own connection there, Sandy, before we move on to the general picture?
Yeah, I was going to say something a little later on at a particular point, for a particular reason. Yeah.
Okay, let's do that. And so looking at this graph that we usually use for this purpose, you can see that this particular parish is quite an important one, ranking among, you know, here are the main Gairloch, Fodderty, Applecross, the usual suspects, but it's only a couple down from that you've got URRAY here, and it's consistent with what I said before, that you look at the mentions of even Taradale, let alone URRAY, in our records, and you see so many pages of people that were there at some time in their lives at even Taradale, let alone, you know, other names in the parish and the parish itself. So, you know, this is an important parish to us as clan members, ranked 6th in this particular time that we've got some sort of numbers to, you know, these are rough, as we know, they're not meant to be too accurate, because who knows what records were kept, baptisms weren't always carried out, books got lost, you know, and so on. But nonetheless, it's what we got to go on, so that's what we use. And, you know, you can get these, those of you that haven't used this resource before, in that dark menu on the left-hand side of the genealogy page, you've got their clan stats to look up, and you can just look up these, and they're created dynamically with the most recent data as you request them. So they take a little while to process, and then you get back the results, including any information that's been added in the last 30 seconds. He records these numbers for births. They record these numbers in these earlier years, again, subject, you know, to error. But, you know, you can see there are quite a few McLennans being born in these parishes. And these don't take account of, as we said before, people who have been born and died before 1841, but were not baptized. So all those people who are in that category, and there'd be quite a lot of them, are not included in these numbers. They were people who were not baptized, that is, or the records of the baptism not kept or lost or something, or they didn't survive till the really the 1851 census is the first one that gives us the parish of birth, and then we know those people were born there even if they're not in the baptismal records. Yep. So this gives you, it's the same all over the country, so it's probably indicative. Oh, I'm pressing advance. You can press advance, Sandy, that'll be good. Let's look at some of the particular McLennans who live in this parish, and it's been a pleasure for me to reread this book that I bought about this Farquhar McLennan, known as Fear Chair a Gunner, or Farquhar of the Gun, also known as the Ross-shire Wanderer. Can you see that on the title for the book, the Ross-shire Wanderer? And this book is about this this fellow, and I bought it some years ago, and it's now available to you to go and read on the clan histories. If you look at the word histories in the main, click on the word histories in the main genealogy page, it will take you to this, or you can go and find the information about him by knowing this ID number for him, 1164. That's his number. And you can see here on this page that Sandy might point out to you, he was born in Compton, but he lived in Taradale. You can see they're born in Compton in 1791. If you go down the page a bit, you can see there he's recorded as being at the Moor of Taradale in the 1841 census, described rather in a politically incorrect way as an idiot. He was notorious for his sayings and pranks that he would pull on people, and funny quips that he'd give back to people when they, asked him a question, sort of puzzling answers to questions. And so that's why, if you look through here, there's some great stories about him and what he would say and not say and so on. This book here that I've got was written by, you can see down in the bottom right-hand corner there, A.B. McLennan was the author of it. You see on this cover here, you can see the name. But for years, I couldn't work out who A.B. McLennan was until finally, only a year or so ago, I worked out he was a policeman. Actually, he was a policeman who spent some time on North Uist and places like that, called Alexander Bain McLennan. In fact, he was from Avoc, which, is a place notorious for having an M in the middle of McLemmon rather than McLennan. When they go out of Avoc, they often put the double N rather than the M. Yeah, he was a policeman, and that's his ID number there, 4532. You can go and have a look at him too. Quite interesting character in his own right. So you can see here the bit of a description in his notes in our database. An easy way to find him, though, is to go to our book called McLennan Places Across Scotland, a guide to some McLennan places, and look up the Muir of Ord distillery in the contents in chapter 20, and you'll see in there you've got a bit of a description about Farquhar and the links through to his book. Thanks, Sandy. So the sort of things he did in life were to earn a bit of money from rock blasting when he was not being an idiot. And he would drill holes in rocks and stuff them with explosives and set them off. And one of the things that I learned in rereading this book that hadn't really occurred to me was that matches, as we know them, which are very convenient things to have, right, did not exist in the 1790s. In fact, they weren't really worked out until the 1830s and refined a bit thereafter. So it's quite interesting to think that what was life like before there were matches? And you take it for granted, don't you, that you can just get a box of matches and start a fire. So this fellow Farquhar, a gunner, when he was doing his exploding rocks, rock blasting, would carry with him a smouldering bit of peat, and he would use that to set off his rocks. It's interesting to think that matches weren't always around, and nobody had matches in the 1790s. Yeah. He was quite religious in his own way. That's what comes out strongly in this book, as well as these pranks and curious responses to questions. he had a rather pre-Enlightenment idea of religion, meaning that you know, he expected hell and damnation if he didn't behave in the acceptable fashion. And quite a few youth would tease him about lots of things, you know, and they would tease him in particular about Sunday observance that we talked about in our last meeting, to try and get him to do things on a Sunday that were frowned upon. So, you know, it's interesting to think what I would recommend reading that book. Once you get in the swing of it and you know that he lived on the Muir of Taradale, and, you know, it's interesting to us, I would recommend you have a read of it on the clan histories there. And there are many stories that were told all around the north of Scotland about his pranks and his, you know, carry on and curious things that he did. Now, another way he earned a few pennies was to deliver his prayer, a prayer that he was known to be willing to recite for a few pennies to earn him some income. Thanks, Sandy. And this is what the prayer, as best the author could find. I'd love to be able to read the Gaelic version, because the author says it loses something in translation to have the translated version there in the book. But there you go. So I can't do that. I won't read it all because it's obviously a bit disobeys all the rules of good slide making by putting a whole slab of text in like that. But, you know, this is the gist of it. The main thing is that he's mentioning all the sort of local things that were important to him as a very, very ordinary person living there on the Muir of Ord and wandering around Scotland. So you get to think what are the things that he knows about and the things that matter to him by reading this, by, you know, thinking about this poem, that this prayer that he's got. He says, "O Blessed Trinity, thou art in America and Australia, and thou art here just now. Thou art like the fish on the hook. The high tide will not let thee off. Oh, thou art the Blessed Trinity. Thou art here just now, and thou art in the Highlands and in Inverness and on the high steeples. Thou art here just now and east of Tain," that's a place we know. "Thou art giving slated houses to the big folk, but thou hast only given a black sooty bothy to me, which won't keep out a raindrop. Every drop falling on Farker's brochan," meaning his gruel. So, you know what a bothy is, don't you? But he's saying the slated roof, meaning, you know, that's the roofs of the slate on the big folks' houses, but he doesn't get anything like that. He's got his black sooty bothy to live in, where the rain comes in. That's good, isn't it? The rain coming into on his oats. And then he says, "Bless the smith who makes the steel which cuts the iron for to be driven into the stones." Yeah, so here he is talking about his stone popping. "Bless the earth, O Trinity, and the gutter, and the yellow hen, and the chickens, the white cow, the milk, the sheep. Bless also the horses, the carts, the ploughs and harrows, the oats, the barley, the potatoes, the fire, the water, all kinds of dishes. Yes, bless them." And so on. He goes, just mentioning all these things. Bless the guns, the powder and the shot, and the birds. Then he lists a whole lot of birds that, you know, he's known to eat these things raw, birds and the like. Pretty good, isn't it? It's a great story. I'd go and read it if I were you. So then he says, "And bless, O Blessed Trinity, the pipes, tobacco, steel and flints, the bones, feathers, rags, keys and iron." He's known to have all these chains and feathers and stuff all over him when he's wandering about. You can see him in that picture up there in the cover of the book in the corner. "Bless also wood, hemp, cotton, tea and sugar, although poor Farker's share of them is small. Bless everything, O Blessed Trinity, for thou thyself has created all. Amen." So this gives you a taste of who this fellow is. It's worth a read. Thanks, Sandy.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. All right. You're
And
going to say something about this guy?
Yep. This is a famous person who you will also find in the guide to McLennan places across Scotland, because if you go to the Ord Distillery today, they'll tell you that it was founded by a Mackenzie, and they're meaning Thomas Mackenzie that Sandy referred to earlier. There's lots of Mackenzie tartan and everything everywhere. You won't get any suggestion that there were any McLennans involved. A bit sad, really. I tried to organise last gathering that we would have a bit of a dram there, Hamish, at the distillery, as a bit of a reminder that McLennans had started this thing. But this fellow, Donald McLennan, you can see if you look down lower there, just to the last line, Sandy, if you could point at that, that in 1841, Donald McLennan, who's referred to up here, 1806 to 1894, is described as distiller. And he's in later censuses described as living in the distillery. So, you know, he's like the key guy. He's got the first license with this fellow, Robert Johnson, but he's the distiller. And after a time, it becomes unlicensed, but they seem to manage to carry on even when it is unlicensed. So this fellow is quite an important character. His son goes off to Glasgow, and you see that's where he dies later in 1894. So, as I say, you can find this fellow and read quite a lot about this distillery and some questions that remain about these McLennans here in the book, A Guide to Some McLennan Places Across Scotland. It's free. You can get it in that, read it online. You can just Google it actually and you'll find it. Or you can go to that dark menu again where the guide is and look up free guide, Scotland guide. There.
Could I make a comment?
Do it. This is your chance. Your moment.
Well, yes. Well,
we can just see your part. Can you get?
I've been trying to find my great grandfather's father. We knew he was illegitimate. Donald McLennan.
Hamish, just stop for a minute. Can you just move back a bit from your camera because we just got your ear there in the picture.
All right. Donald McLennan's father was Alexander McLennan, Hilton Farm, Muirvord. In 1851, Anne McClay from North Keswick took him to a paternity case in the Sheriff Court in Dingwall, and she won the case over the child, and the child was my great-grandfather. So in legal terms, I'm off a bastard line. It took me years to find this out, and it's Find My Past website. It was the last Anne McClay on the list, and it came back with my answer.
Yeah.
And that Donald McLennan, after he was in the distillery, he became a great expert of cattle, sending cattle to the Argentine and all these places. That's all, folks.
Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you, Hamish. It's a good story, isn't it? And we've got all that documented now in the clan records. Thanks to Hamish's discovery of that court case. That's a really good thing. But this is a really interesting story. A couple of years ago, I went out to a place to the north, towards Urry, really, the locality of Urry, but going a sort of slightly lower route across the Orrin further up than normally. And there was one of these dram houses there run by a McLennan who presumably was the one that later took over the license of this distillery. But he had this, and the place names book that was done for the OS maps talks about it as a disgraceful affair. The whole thing is, you know, ramshackled and run down and hardly worthy of the name of being an inn. So that's a bit of a great character in the McLennan story, and you can find him in the Guide to McLennan Places. And if you ever go to the Ord Distillery to have a wee dram, then remind them that it was a McLennan who was there at the beginning, not only the laird who owned the land. Next slide, Sandy.
Okay, back to me then, is it?
Yep.
Yep. Okay, looking at the time, I'll try and get through this fairly sharpish. I just wanted to pick out one notable family from the area, the Murchisons of Taradale. It starts briefly with John Murchison of Ochter Tyre, which is on the Loch Alsh, and maybe we'll hear more about him next time. He was a major in the army of William Mackenzie, was the 5th Earl of Seaforth, and as we know, a staunch Jacobite. And along with his brother, Colonel Donald Murchison, in command, John and Donald led Mackenzie's, Monroe's, and McLennans at the Battle of Sheriff Muir in the 1715 rebellion, and he was actually killed there. Later on, his son Alexander became a factor in the Seaforth estate, but the Taradale connection begins really with his son, Dr. Kenneth Murchison. He became a surgeon and made his fortune as working for the governor of Bengal and the East India Company. And he was clearly quite an influential guy. He has a portrait of him in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, which is painted by Sir Henry Raeburn, Scotland's foremost portrait painter. So he must have been quite a well-known and influential individual to have his portrait done by Raeburn. And when he came back to Scotland, having made his money, he married a Barbara Mackenzie, surprise, of Taradale, and then purchased the estate from her family in 1788. Oh, there we are. Yeah, sorry, I forgot about this. That's well, just a picture there. You can see where Taradale House is on the Taradale estate, and this is the River Bewley. So Muir of Ord is just kind of up here. Again, that house is probably not the one he was in. This would have been a later house. Later on, he devoted his later years to the gratuitous care of the sick and poor of Rochshire, etc., etc. So he was quite a philanthropist, it seems. But his main contribution was to have 2 children, one of whom, the elder boy, Roderick Impey Murchison, was a very, very famous geologist. He was born in 1792 at Taradale House. Now, he had many, many achievements, but he's probably best remembered for first describing the Silurian geological system. That's a geological period that corresponds roughly to the emergence of multicellular life on dry land, just to put it in context. And you can see he held numerous positions: President, Royal Geographical Society, pardon me, etc., etc., numerous medals and awards. And one of his most famous predictions was to predict the existence of gold in Australia even before it had been discovered. He asked some Cornish miners who were going out there to bring back some samples for him, because from the geology of the place, he suspected there would be gold there. And when he analysed it, there was gold there. And that really began the gold rush to Australia. And as a result of that, this man from Taradale is remembered all throughout, not just the world, but the moon. There's a Murchison crater on the moon, and things named after him all over the place, including Australia and New Zealand. And a little tale there. I was on holiday a few years ago in New Zealand in the Hawke's Bay area, and was staying in a lovely B&B run by a woman who said she was from the township of Taradale in Hawke's Bay. And I asked her, "Oh, do you know how that place got its name?" And she had no idea. So I told her it was called Taradale by a farmer who had come from Taradale in Victoria, Australia, to farm the land in New Zealand, and gave the area the name Taradale. And Taradale in Victoria had itself been called Taradale in honour of this chap, Roderick Murchison, who was born in Taradale in the Black Isle. And Taradale was a gold mining town, so they obviously wanted to recognise Murchison's contribution to that. And on that estate, the Taradale estate, there is a farm called Taradale Mains, and that's where my grandfather was born. And there's the Ducot and the Mains of Taradale Farm. She was quite tickled by that story. I think I got a free drink out of it as well, so that was good. So that's my connection.
Sandy, this morning I had 2 people who were cousins, and they said their grandfather was born in a place called Murchison in Victoria.
Oh yeah, well, yeah. I mean, his name crops up all over the place. So yeah, this is my grandfather. He wasn't a tenant farm, and he didn't own the land. He was a simple ploughman, whose father came from Fodderty and his mother from Kilmorrock. She was a McDermott from Kilmorrock, and they were all just, farm labourers. And I just wonder now, if he was able to see me doing this, what the hell he'd make of it all. So there we go. Yeah, he's remembered all over the place, this man from Taradale, including in Russia. There's a monument to him, this great slab of rock outside a school in the town of Perm in the Ural Mountains. And if we can just zoom in on that, as I'm sure you can see, this says, Rodrigo Impimierczysonu szotlandzkiemu geologu исследователю Пермского края, назвавшему последний период палеозойской эры Пермским. That O-level Russian came in handy. I knew it would one day. That translates as to Roderick Impey Murchison, Scottish geologist, explorer of the Perm Krai, the region, who gave the name Permian to the final period of the Paleozoic era. So he not only worked in the Silurian period, but he also actually gave the name Permian after the work he did in Perm in Russia. So a well-respected guy. He had a brother, Kenneth, who was also an influential fellow, worked for the East India Company and was governor of the Straits Settlement for a while, but we won't say any more about him. See, time marches on. Curiosities in the area. We'll just finish off fairly quickly. There's a figure that I'm sure a lot of you will have heard of, the Brain or Bran Seer, Scotland's answer to Nostradamus, a man allegedly endowed with the gift of second sight. According to legend, he was born Kenneth Mackenzie and he came from Uig and Lewis, and he worked as a labourer on the Brain estate in the 1670s. He was commonly known as Cynnig Ohar or Kenneth the Sallow because of his complexion, I assume. And it was reputed that he got his visions by looking through a hole in a small stone, and there's a wooden sculpture of him in Strathpeffer Spa Gardens. You can see him holding up this little stone and looking through it. Now, I thought it would be a little bit of fun here if you could guess what some of these predictions actually were. See if you know what this is referring to. O Dramosi, thy bleak moor shall, ere many generations have passed away, be stained with the best blood of the Highlands. Glad I am that I will not see the day, for it will be a fearful period. Heads will be lopped off by the score. No mercy shall be shown or given, etc. What do you think that's referring to?
Culloden?
Culloden, absolutely. Yep. There's a few others. Great black bridleless horses belching fire and steam. It's pretty clear what that is. The railways. The joining of the lochs in the Great Glen. What would that be?
Caledonian Canal.
Absolutely. And I like this one. A black rain that will bring riches to Aberdeen.
Oil.
It's got to be the North Sea oil, isn't it? Yeah. So that's he also predicted the end of the Mackenzies of Fairburn. Remember, we saw Fairburn Tower that had fallen into disrepair. And he said there will be a cow giving birth in an upper chamber. I suppose that's not so bad. And that hasn't been observed, but I guess derelict buildings and cows tend to go together in that area. So maybe not a great prediction.
I think that has come to pass.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It did happen, but it's perhaps no great surprise.
The Fairburn building is going to be completely. They're going to. There's planning application in to reinstate it.
Really?
Yeah. It'll be interesting.
That'll be good. Yeah, it'll be good to see that. He also predicted the end of the direct line of the Mackenzies of Seaforth, with the last one being deaf and dumb. And indeed, Francis Mackenzie, say the first Baron that we saw, he was born with hearing and speech impediments due to having scarlet fever, and all four of his four legitimate sons died prematurely. So indeed, he was the last of that direct line. But just how much of this is true, seems to be little in the way of any documented evidence that his prophecies were actually made before these things came to pass. But it's a nice story. And there's a plaque commemorating him at Chanonry Point near Fortrose, a great place for watching dolphins. And this is allegedly where he was burnt to death for his prophecies. Okay, finally, just any others? If you're interested in archaeology, there are some nice standing stones at Wind Hill, just south of Muir of Ord, before you get to Bewley. And one final thing, coming back to Taradale, as I always do, the current owner of Taradale Estate, it's Dr. Eric Grant from Aberdeen, is an archaeologist, and he's initiated this Taradale Through Time project, which you can Google if you're interested. He's looking at all the different eras that Taradale has been through, particularly looking at Taradale Castle, which was a sort of classical Motte and Bailey castle on the site of the old site of Taradale House itself. This was actually captured by the English King Edward I as part of his attempt to seize sovereignty over Scotland, and as a result of which it was then destroyed by Robert Bruce. But they are trying to dig that up and investigate that. But people have lived around there for thousands and thousands of years, and there are quite a number of Mesolithic and Neolithic sites with artifacts dating back thousands of years. This is stuff from what's called a shell midden, which is a refuse dump mainly of mollusk cells, and there are flint and losing my voice, quartz scrapers also found in this site. So yeah, if you're interested in that, you can always look that up there. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening to that presentation. These are the things that we've looked at. I think I need to read through those. We've pretty well covered everything there. Okay, thank you.